Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome back to returning attendees. We're certainly glad to have you back. And at this time, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the third panel dialogue of the 5 series titled Unsettled Ethical Issues in Gene Drive Research. My name is Rafiq Elias, and I'm the Program Manager at McMaster University's Institute on Ethics and Policy for Innovation, also known as IEPI. This series, produced through the Gene Drive Research Forum, is the product of partnership between IEPI and FNH Gene Convene Global Collaborative. Through this panel discussion series, we intend to explore burning ethical concerns related to research, testing, and implementation of gene drive technologies for application to improve public health, to preserve biodiversity, and to address food security concerns. Before I introduce to this session, I'd just like to highlight that if you're unable to stay with us for the entire duration, don't be discouraged. This and the previous sessions are publicly available and can be viewed on the Gene Convene YouTube channel. So in this session, we will discuss who owes what to whom, what is the nature and scope of responsibilities of the various actors. Today's session is moderated by Dr. Jim Lavery from the Faculty of the Center for Ethics at Emory University, where he leads the development of Human Engagement Learning Platform, also known as HELP for Global Health. The platform is designed to support first and implementation partners to improve community and stakeholder engagement and organizational learning in global health and global development programs. Dr. Lavery is a professor in the Hebert Department of Global Health at the Rollins School of Public Health and Conrad N. Hilton Chair in Global Health Ethics. He is also a fellow of the Hastings Center, a member of the board of directors of the Council for Health Research for Development, a member of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee of Health Campaign Effectiveness Coalition at the Task Force for Global Health, and a member of the Bioethics Advisory Panel for Pfizer Inc. So I personally anticipate this to be a lively discussion, so let's buckle up. And Dr. Lavery, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Rafiq, for that very generous introduction, and welcome everyone to this third webinar in the series. The first two have been really outstanding, so we expect the same today. We are extremely fortunate to have just an absolutely outstanding panel today to discuss this really pressing question about the nature of obligations, who owes what to whom, what's the nature and scope of responsibilities of the various actors in the development of gene drive technologies. I'm going to start off with some brief introductions of each of the panelists. I'll do that up front, and then I'll ask each of them to make a kind of opening statement of maybe about 5 minutes to give us a sense of their kind of core ideas. And then we're going to open it up and have a very lively discussion about this very interesting and important issue. So I'm going to start off by introducing David Nderitu. David is a lecturer of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy, History, and Religious Studies at Egerton University in Njoro, Kenya. And he's a member of the Bioethics Society of Kenya and a member of the Egerton University Research Ethics Committee. He specializes in African philosophy and African indigenous worldviews and social ethics, as well as bioethics and research ethics. And his research interests include the relevance and applicability of universal research ethics standards in African cultural contexts. And highly germane to our conversation today, David's Ph.D. research was on the Aristotelian concept of friendship among unequal partners in North-South global health research collaborations. And David joins us this morning from beautiful Naivasha, Kenya. Next, I'm going to introduce Phil Randazzo. Phil is the founder and CEO of Leverage Science, a consulting firm based in Berkeley, California. Phil is also a senior advisor at the Institute on Ethics and Policy for Innovation that Rafiq just introduced at McMaster University in Canada, and a senior advisor for the Islamic Development Bank's Transform Fund. Phil previously served as Deputy Director of Discovery at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and managed an extensive portfolio spanning health, agriculture, education, and policy topics, in addition to most of the the investments in gene drive development. And I had the very good fortune to have Phil as my program officer for about 10 years during my initial work with the Gates Foundation. So welcome, Phil, as well. Next, I'd like to introduce Nanjira Sambuli. Nanjira is a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program, excuse me, at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's also a Ford Global Fellow in the Ford Foundation's Global Fellowship Program. She's president and co-chair of the Transform Health Coalition for Universal Health Coverage. And her research and policy and strategy work focuses on the gendered impacts of information and communications technology and their adoption and their impact on media, governance, entrepreneurship, and culture. And Nanjira sits on a long list of advisory boards, but just to give you a flavor, she's an advisory board member for the World Economic Forum's Technology and Social Justice Initiatives, the A+ Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms, the Carnegie Council's AI and Equality Initiative, the Humanitarian News Agency, Development Gateway, and Digital Impact Alliance. And she's obviously a very busy human being. So Nanjira, thanks for taking the time this morning, this afternoon. And finally, I'd like to introduce Jantina de Vries. Jantina is an associate professor. Oh, and I should say that Nanjira is joining us this morning, this afternoon from Nairobi. And finally, I'd like to introduce Jantina de Vries. She's an associate professor of bioethics in the Department of Medicine at the University of Cape Town. She was the founding chair of H3 Africa Working Group on Ethics and co-directs the H3 Africa Individual Findings in Genetic Research, or the IF-GNRA Collaborative Center. And she's a member of the Research Ethics Board of Médecins Sans Frontières, the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Board on Genome Editing, and the steering committee of the Global Forum for Bioethics in Research. And she's also, like Nanjira and everyone else, involved in a number of other advisory boards related to international genomics research. She's also an ethics and science reviewer for the European Commission. So a bit of an extensive introduction, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the just the range and scope of expertise that we have with us today. So with that, then I'd like to kick things off by handing over to David. And David, if you could open us up with some initial thoughts to get things rolling.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you everyone for attending this. I'm so much privileged to be part of this, and what I'm going to say is that I'm not an expert in gene drive technology. I'm a lay person, but there are some issues that have captured my attention. And today, I'm going to speak about what I think are very critical, and most of the things I'll be saying are my opinions, some of which will be repetitive. Since I'm speaking from ignorance in terms of this area, you'll bear with me if I say anything that maybe is out of ignorance. Now, this is a very important and critical project. And the question of who owes what to whom is very crucial, and as large as it may look, it touches on specific issues. Now, I'm going to just talk about reflections from Africa. And I'm just going to give my perspective from Africa. Now, there are a number of stakeholders which are involved in this, and most of whom owe something to someone. And my general, my general perspective is that the ultimate person who is owed anything by anyone is the research community where this project is undertaken. Now, I will be mentioning some of the people or some of the stakeholders that I think owe something to someone. And the first one that come into my mind are the Western countries. And I think Western countries owe Africa some responsibility of investing more in malaria eradication efforts. This has been happening, and even within the gene drive technology, we have partners from the West who are doing marvelous work. But I'll put something on that. I'll say that Western countries, particularly the colonial countries, have got moral responsibility to invest more in malaria eradication efforts. And this is informed by the fact that there is evidence to show that some colonial activities are purported to have increased or vary the spread of malaria. And this is due to altered environs because of some of those activities. For example, the land alienation, which forced people to move from one place to another. And in the process, people who had developed some immunity to malaria were forced, were finding themselves infected by malaria. And that has been the case throughout, even after the colonial period. The second one are the various stakeholders in malaria eradication who are playing particularly specific parts in it, starting with the international organizations. These people have done well to fund or to even sponsor research and healthcare. But I also think that they need to do extra homework. They need to pursue actual local needs. Sometimes they're misguided by local contact persons to pursue aspects that are not real. We have African governments. African governments need to support efforts to eradicate malaria. Some of them have been doing this, but they still need to set right priorities, particularly in resource allocation. They need to support research and healthcare. So far, very few countries in Africa are said to have fulfilled the requirement to give a certain percentage of their annual budget to healthcare, according to Abuja Declaration. They also need to establish relevant regulations for biotechnology, particularly talking about gene-drive technology and biosafety systems to ensure that everything is done according to a certain system. They also need to ensure adequate capacity strengthening of local scientists. If you read so far the literature that is there about gene-drive technology, you'll find that it seems to rely so much on individual expertise and expertise from certain few institutions, but they don't rely so much on the systems. So if gene-drive technology is going to come here, it has to land through some systems. We also have local institutions and researchers, and some few people have been making a lot of effort to ensure that malaria is eradicated. But there is evidence to show that sometimes there is insincerity, particularly in their engagement. There is what we call the syndrome of doing it for professional profile enhancement or for personal gain or for institutional profile. And this kind of reality is not so far-fetched. There's some people who've really shown that they're getting into these partnerships or collaboration for the sake of that. The affected communities, who I call the main stakeholders, I don't know, they have always played their role, being there and giving out their information and also allowing people to come into their space and do experiments. But do they owe anybody anything? I think they owe. Who do they owe? They owe their future generation. They ought to be vigilant and very alert on what is done to them, because whatever is done sometimes affects generations to come. So they always have to be vigilant, and that's what they owe to everybody else. Now, researchers also owe proper communication on gene-drive technology to research communities. The whole aspect about science communication, explaining complex scientific concepts, which in Africa, we don't even have time for them. Unfortunately, the lingua franca of science is English and other foreign languages. And therefore, we lack some words to represent some of these concepts. And therefore, the research community has got a very big responsibility of ensuring that they communicate this science properly to the communities where they are carrying out their research. They also need to, as part of their informed consent process, they need to clearly address safety concerns which are raised by some of these communities. And some of these concerns are not unfounded. The worry is informed by past experiences in the existential reality of the African communities, particularly some of the issues that are still discussed in the villages and also in the marketplaces. In Kenya, for example, there is a common discussion about jiggers. Jiggers are said to have been introduced by the colonial government as part of their biological warfare to immobilize freedom fighters. And jiggers still remain a big menace in Kenya today. Around the institution where I come from, Egerton University, there is always this, I don't know if it's a myth or it's reality. During the warm period, there are a lot of mosquitoes around Njoro town and Nakuru. And you'll always find villagers and people around there saying that these are mosquitoes from Egerton University, that researchers from Egerton University, they bred some mosquitoes, and because they're doing some experiments, then they release them. And these kind of things are not just far-fetched, they are very true. There's also concern about the future of the genetically modified mosquitoes in terms of environment and biodiversity and also human health. There are also concerns about mutations and all kinds of things, because people in Africa, whenever they get an information, and if they are given wrong information, they tend to go with the negative information. And all issues concerning genetically modified organisms have always caused scare. They are still unsettled. And therefore, it is paramount for the research community to explain all this openly. Another thing that should be addressed are other concerns which might be seen as if they are peripheral. For example, since mosquitoes are going to be released into the environment, there are other concerns like the irritating buzzes and the bites. No, I'm one person who has been affected by malaria, and I still live with mosquitoes. And when I was a child, I used to suffer from malaria, but nowadays I don't suffer from malaria, but I still live with mosquitoes, and there is nothing irritating like the buzzing of a mosquito. And sometimes it can make you lose your sleep. And these are some of the things that if gene-derived technology is going to release some mosquitoes, some of these things needs to be addressed. Finally, the gene-derived technology researchers or scientific and research communities, proper justification for selection of sites. I've been exploring some of the literature and also some of the ideas about gene technology and the plan they have for Africa. And I realized that the selection seems to target remote villages. And I'm wondering, as a person who has suffered malaria and I've never lived in a village, I've always lived in an urban center, did you think that they are unfairly living out or excluding the urban centers? Or is the selection out of convenience? Are researchers concerned about the potential resistance from the urban middle class? Or are they over-researching on the rural areas? These are some of the issues that I think we need to address, and the research community owes all this to Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. That was a wonderful overview of lots of issues. Just to flag a couple of things, and I think this notion of colonial activities and their role in the perpetuation of malaria, creating some kinds of obligations of investment or maybe even reparations, I think is something that we'll want to pick up on, and as well the idea about the importance of host country investment and in both science and technology and in health and health systems, and this notion that you raised, I think, about intergenerational obligations, I think in particular are really important themes. Phil, none of those themes is new to you, and I'm going to hand it over to you now to maybe pick up on that and here's some initial thoughts.
Yeah, so thank you, David, for all those great points that you made, and I'll sort of go from there. And so in terms of what I'm gonna talk about 6 freedoms, which I think the world owes to Africa, and so one can think of that as the Western countries, but I think we can think about it globally as well. And that is, one is the freedom to innovate. And so that's a shout out to Calestis Juma. And that is allowing African scientists and people on the ground in Africa to be able to innovate and to support that. The second is the freedom to be able to lead, try, and test. And so I think the world should be mindful of being supportive of the African scientific leadership and their and supporting their ability to try and test new interventions for malaria that are greatly needed. The third is the freedom to do it right and at the right pace. And so the freedom to do it right, actually, I think speaks to one of David's points, and that is to be robustly funded. And so if you're going to take on this type of research, and if one is going to properly try and test to see if the technology will be safe and if it will be efficacious, then that means that the work has to be robustly funded. This type of stuff can't be done on the cheap. And so the fourth is the freedom to choose whether or not to deploy based on the experience and evidence. And so that means being able to test and try, and then having the freedom to make a decision based on the science and the evidence. A fifth point of freedom is a freedom from misinformation. I think David had mentioned that as well. And so I think the world owes to the people on the continent freedom from misinformation. Misinformation is something that, particularly with science and particularly with new technologies, is something that runs rampant around the world. And I think the world needs to be mindful of not creating misinformation. So individuals around the world should be mindful about not misinforming and not being part of the sort of the enterprise of channeling misinformation and amplifying it. And then finally, I think because lives are at stake in terms of helping to prevent deaths and disability and malaria, the freedom from distant political battles. And so I think the Western world needs to not, there's sort of philosophical battles about technology to the continent. I think it's up to the people on the continent to try and make the decisions on whether to, how to, and whether to deploy technologies. So those are the 6 freedoms that I want to urge the world to be mindful of. So the freedom to innovate, the freedom to lead, try and test, the freedom to do it right and at the right pace, the freedom to choose whether or not to deploy based on experience and evidence, freedom of misinformation, and freedom from political battles. So I think that's all I have to say at this point.
Thank you, Phil. That was excellent and very concise. And I think already you can see, as you already pointed out, some connections, even initially with some of David's points. I think this notion that you emphasized about robust funding and being able to do this right really maps on to this notion of the proper kinds of investment, both in sort of external funding, but also in government funding within the deploying or testing countries. So thank you for that, Phil. We're going to turn now to Nanjira.
Thanks, Jim. And I'll also focus on what is owed to the African. And it's really interesting to see how there's a convergence on this issue, just showing how much we haven't moved from talk to walking the talk. And likewise, just like David and Phil, I'll highlight what may seem like overlapping areas that they've already touched upon. Starting for me with the fact that Western researchers and institutions owe what I'll call the African subject, since that's what she is usually referred to, They're owed first and foremost an apology for years of treating her as a guinea pig and as a lesser being not deserving of dignity in the experiments that have been conducted over centuries, as David has given us some examples. And many of these experiments still inform how scientific research is conducted, including in genetics. One can venture, and I will venture as far as stating that the African subject is owed reparations for past and present atrocities. I'll give you two examples. Several African countries were involved in the trial tests for COVID-19 vaccines, several of them, in fact, and yet today, millions are yet to access these vaccines. We're not even at the 10% mark of vaccinating the African population. And the sustained charge by the Namibians for the German government to go beyond just offering an apology for what was a genocide that was guised under, among other things, scientific research, is something that should remind us that the past does inform the present, and we really do need to figure out how we put stop it and make sure that the future is not always tainted by these. Secondly, Western researchers and institutions owe the African subject an ethics that goes beyond lip service and tick the box compliance aspects like consent forms that are filled, but this is not consent that is informed or meaningful. They owe her an ethics guided by dignity and morality that appreciates the African not just as a source of diverse DNA whose secrets can change the world, as a 2020 Financial Times article put it, but also as an actor and an agent with indigenous and contemporary insights that should be accommodated in every step of the research process, from deliberation to decision-making to deployment and any other intermediary stage. It's an ethics that needs to decenter the non-African as a savior or the one who knows what's best for the African in high environment. This is an ethics of humility in praxis and not just in virtue signaling. And in contemporary dynamics affecting the African subject, she is more than a pawn in the emerging techno-geopolitical competition, extending to even gene drive research. By this, I mean that a lot of how technology is being applied into this field, and I mean emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, are increasingly being put as a US versus China, and Africa is up for grabs. So basically the African is datafied as becomes a data set of their own body, is a data set everybody is trying to grab. And the way these technologies are being applied is still undergirded by the injustices and inequities that determine who shapes even the technologies and applications in fields like genomics. Just like David and Phil have pointed out, African governments and policymakers, including their supporters, especially in development communities, owe the African subject the investments in sustainable, independent institutions that can house indigenous and contemporary knowledge by homegrown scholars to contribute to gene drive research. The truth of the matter is, and maybe we can get into it, too many initiatives and institutions are simply not set up to last. I'll close by quoting Chinua Achebe in an essay called Africa is People, where he simply puts it as, you're developing new drugs and feeding them to a bunch of laboratory guinea pigs and hoping for the best. I have news for you. Africa is not fiction. Africa is people, real people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nanjira. These are just very rich comments. I'm looking forward already to opening this up in the discussion. I really appreciated the shout out to Chinua Achebe there at the end. I just finished Arrow of God, which is a incredible and difficult book, but love the call out there. A couple of points, again, to try to make some connections in advance of the discussion. I think, Nanjira, your point about apology is extremely important and something that we tend to just neglect. I think the role of apology as a form of acknowledgement and a form of humility, I think these are some of the depths we need to get to in the way that we think about ethics, and they shouldn't be divorced, I think, from the deeper technological discussions of the technologies themselves. So really, really appreciated those comments and this idea about the being mindful of the presumptuousness of capabilities of people on the continent. We all know that there are capacity issues, but we also, all of us here also know that there is no lack of talent and capability in the continent. So I think that mindfulness about presumptuousness there is really, really important. Speaking of the continent, let's go to its southern tip. Now to Jantina.
Right, wonderful contributions already. And I wish we'd had this discussion before we even started today so that we could dive even deeper into some of these issues. So I prepared a response, but I'm actually going to start somewhere else, which is following on more directly from Nanjira's contribution, and relates to questions about where and why science and experimentation is located in particular areas of the continent and not others. So, for instance, a lot of the gene drive research that is, I think, currently happening, I think the South African government was initially approached to host some of that research, but South Africa has got a very strong regulatory infrastructure and relatively strong governments, and so this government decided that actually no, those experiments weren't going to take place here, and they're now taking place elsewhere. And I think there's really important questions there about why and how science and particular population is conducted in particular areas, and what that means for how we think about ethics and how we think about the rights of the people who are involved in those experiments. What I was going to say is I was going to point to the Human Rights Charter, and particularly the right of people across the world to share in the benefits of scientific progress. So if we accept that that is a human right, what that right means is that all people across the world should equally and without discrimination have access to the benefits of science and their application so that they can live a dignified life. So that is how we kind of think about that right, and directly tie a right to enjoy the benefits of science to individuals' ability to lead a dignified life. And I think that seems to me to be relevant in this discussion, because it reminds us of the importance of ensuring that everyone, regardless of where they live and what cultures they come from or how wealthy they are, that those people have a right to benefit from gene drive research if the outcomes of such research can help people lead a dignified life. So to the extent that we think that gene drive research can help us do that, we then need to focus our attention on questions of equity, which is, I think, where what I'm contributing starts to resonate with what Nanjira was saying, and perhaps what Phil and David were saying as well. Equity for means the tools and the instruments that we need to adopt, that everyone has a fair chance to benefit equally, right? So how do we ensure that people around the world have a fair chance to benefit equally? And that is a duty, I think, that accrues to all. And so my first response really in the question of who owes what to whom is that we all owe each other the effort or the work that goes into ensuring that the benefits of gene drive research are equally available to everyone across the world. And we've already heard from the other panelists that is a very exacting duty, right? It's a very exacting duty because we know that our world is deeply unequal. We know that there are really important challenges around achieving health equity, and COVID has laid them bare within countries and at the global level. And so the first duty, I think the first response to who owes what to whom for me is that we owe each other the work that is required to make this world a fairer place, right? And to the extent that gene drive research is part of that broader sort of call to justice, that is the work that we owe each other. And that's not easily done. Against that human right, and I come to the second kind of response to thinking about who owes what to whom, is an equally important right to freedom from scientific research. And I think that is starting to lean towards where Phil was also going. And for me, that means that everyone, of course, has a right to refuse to participate in research. And that is not only a legal right in many countries, including in South Africa, but of course, it's not that easy to actuate in the context of something like gene drive research, where if a community gives permission, that that experiment affects everybody living in that community, whether they individually agreed or not. And perhaps that's something we can pick up later. But for me, what is very important in this is that we need to respect the rights of everyone to not participate in gene drive research. And regardless whether that decision is made at the level of individuals or communities, districts or countries, and I think this is where my contribution overlaps with Phil's, is that we owe each other the right to be skeptical or hesitant about scientific innovations, or to accept innovations on our own terms. And that, I think, is what Phil and Nanjira were also saying. And then what seems to me really important, and this is the third kind of response to the duty, or to the question of what do we owe each other, is that there seems to me a balance and between these rights, and the balance is that we all have a right for scientific and technological developments not to be imposed on anyone, but for technological and scientific developments to be driven by a genuine commitment to engaged science, where the many stakeholders involved in gene drive research have an opportunity to articulate what it means to lead a dignified life, but also to refuse to participate. So what I mean by that is that, and this follows on what Nanjira was saying, everybody should have a right to accept or reject gene drive research on their own terms for their own reasons, right? Without necessarily reference to the interests of others. And this seems to me to be especially important, and this is where I overlap with Dan's contributions, in the perpetuation of colonialist types of engagement in global health research that we have seen, and that seem to me to have been epitomized in gene drive research, where a lot of the science is being developed in wealthier countries, and yet the experimentation is happening, at least some experimentation is happening on the African continent, on African peoples. And so in a pluralistic world, and one of very stark inequalities, including health inequalities, my third response to the question of who owes what to whom is that we owe each other the respect and courtesy to listen to different worldviews and ontologies, to draw on the plurality of our knowledge systems to guide the development of an engaged and responsible gene drive research. That's my contribution to the pot.
Thank you, Jantina. Excuse me. Just terrific contributions all around. Let me pick up on a couple of things that you said, Jantina, maybe use it as a bit of a springboard to move into the open discussion here. I think this notion about being guided in all of these activities by by wanting to contribute to helping people live a dignified life. I mean, this whole concept of dignity, it's slightly contested, but it's still, people have a sense about what we mean when we invoke that term. So I really like that as a kind of guiding thought. But what I wanted to pick up on, Jantina, because I think it's such an important aspect of this whole conversation is this idea about the right to freedom from scientific research, and the kind of paradox that you laid out, that the entire research ethics paradigm that we operate under is really driven by individual autonomy. And yet we have technologies like gene drive that actually don't apply at the individual level. So the notion of consent at an individual level really loses traction, and we get to some more complex notions of authorization by communities or by governments. And I wanted to kind of throw this over to David. David, I know you do a lot of work on research ethics, and you also mentioned stakeholders in your initial comments. Yeah. How do we get to, in a technology like gene drive, how do we get to that balance between ensuring that either individuals or communities or countries, as Jantina said with South Africa, are in positions to not participate in these in the development of the technologies if they like. It's a tough question, but any initial thoughts on that, David?
Well, I think it all boils down to respecting people's individual opinions and rights, but also also respecting the kind of worldviews that they live through. Because there are so many reasons why people might want to participate in research or not, some of which are informed by realistic experiences in the past, but also some of them might be out of maybe ignorance or misinformation. So first of all, in that situation, it means that it's upon the scientific community to give all the information that is needed in the right way, so that when people are making such decisions, they are making them out of informed, like they have a lot of information. They are making this decision because they have the right information. And therefore, we avoid them making such a decision when they don't have full information or they have wrong information about it. So it's about giving the right information and giving a lot of information. I was talking about the issue of consent, full disclosure, and explaining some of these concepts clearly using a language that can be understood, so that making a decision to participate or not is out of an informed choice.
Great, thank you, David. And let me turn to Nanjira first, and then Phil. Nanjira, I really liked the way that you kind of introduced this idea of needing a better ethic or better ethics to approach these things, and I liked your notions of humility and praxis. I believe is the way that you framed it. So I wonder how. Could you expand on that a little bit for us in terms of what David's saying and in terms of having to recognize different worldviews and maybe change the way that we think about what we're trying to accomplish with the ethics in the first place?
Yeah, well, I guess it will apply differently across different stakeholder groups. I mean, let me take the example of Kenya, for example, which is one area geographically that has a sample of humans who are so over-tested, over-researched. And it's over time, there's also something to be said about studying what that effect has in terms of the trust in science, or even in vaccines right now, and other scientific discoveries, because the subject, right from colonial period to contemporary society, where they purportedly live in an independent country, there hasn't yet been that element where their voice can really be honestly brought into that conversation. And I want to introduce a concept of power dynamics too. If you're going to a remote part of a country today to study or get, Turkana would be an interesting area to focus. It's in north of Kenya, very close to the cradle of mankind. So somebody who's trying to find diverse DNA data sets might just get on a hop and get there. These are people who till today are still waiting for basic infrastructure from their community, from their country, from their governments to serve them. Right now, the country is undergoing a drought, and they're one of the first hardest hit communities. When a researcher, let's say from a laboratory, whether it's from Nairobi, the capital, or from an international community, goes there, and that's the only person who may have any incentive in cash or kind for them to actually feed themselves or get their kids to school, that power dynamic already affects what Jantina was talking about, the right to opt out. So there's so many nuances that we need to bring to this. And often when you bring this up, a lot of people get frustrated, but I'm like, that is the complexity with which we need to sit, because these are people, like I said, these are not just subjects that to think of as, if X, then Y kind of variables. And so there's a bit of work there, I would say is almost even restorative and reparative work to the approach that has already become the norm. Where the difference with gene drive research is that, unlike, say, asking people about perceptions, it's not as easy to obfuscate. Here, there are elements where maybe you're participating in a particular study might get you access to healthcare because somebody set up a clinic and is using a quick medical test as an incentive. So that's just to show the the humility, so the question becomes, when you craft your research approach that way, your study approach that way, where is the humility in understanding the predicament of this particular community I just tried to bring to life here? Why is your approach the right approach? What would have been a different way if you had arrived in that community to better understand where they are, what are their, what their histories, their concerns about even these issues, because they're also, all indigenous communities also very scientific. It just shows you that a lot of how we've structured us is also siloed, so we're not seeing these things from the 360 perspective that we need to introduce. So I like to leave these kinds of comments having complicated them rather than necessarily trying to simplify them.
Great, thank you for that, Nanjira. And I want to pick up on that and come to Phil. And Phil, I loved your framing of the 6 freedoms. It's sort of reminiscent of the Marchesen and development as freedom. I want to pick up on 2 of them. One, this idea about the freedom to do it right, but then your final freedom, this idea about sort of philosophic or political imposition. And I'm wondering whether in the blend of those 2 freedoms, whether we need to be doing it right means incorporating more of the kinds of insights that Nanjira and David have just shared in those comments. I mean, do we need to really rethink sort of the ethics from the ground up? Because we're still stuck a little bit in this kind of paradigm of individual consent, and I think it's not serving us very well. So any thoughts, Phil, about that? What doing it right means, and what we have to do to avoid that kind of imposition that you talked about?
So when I mentioned sort of doing it right, that means funding the research so that corners aren't cut, so that there's plenty of funding for community engagement, for that it's not just a technical funding, but and that the funding is robust enough to really test all aspects of the technology in terms of safety and efficacy. And so that's what I mean in terms of robustness, and in building the capacity, so that the work on the ground is done in a way where it's co-developed and where the technology isn't just parachuted in. And so that's what I meant by that. In terms of the individual versus the collective, I mean, that's always, across lots of different technologies and in a lot of different places in the world, that's always a tension. For instance, smallpox vaccine. At least I can give you an example in, the US in Boston, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, long time ago, everyone was forced to take a smallpox vaccine because that was for the collective good. And so that's one extreme example. Other examples one can think about in terms of the benefit for the community versus an individual, what individuals want in terms of opting out. For example, building of a new road, for example, might benefit an entire community, yet not everyone is going to want that, and so I think it's a difficult question, but I think it's a question that is answered in a lot of different sectors all the time in different places. And so I'm not too sure what else to say about that and whether I answered all your questions.
Well, one of the challenges in a panel like this, Phil, is that the questions are, deeply complex, and so I think those points were really helpful. Let me try to pick up on another point. Maybe we can come back at some of those ideas about the authorization challenges in through a different channel. We've just been witnessing it with COVID vaccine distribution, how the rhetoric about equity and how much we rely on the narrative of equitable distribution, and just how fragile it is, and what a rank failure it has been in terms of equitable distribution of COVID vaccines around the world for a lot of very complex reasons. But Jantina, your point about equity, really viewing equity as a fair chance to benefit equally from these technologies. It seems to me that we still have very similar challenges in the development and production of the technologies, the way that they're distributed. I mean, it can't happen around the world all at the same time. So how do we operationalize that idea of fair chance to benefit equally? I wonder if you could unpack that for us a little bit.
I can try.
Yeah, I'm sorry, like brutally hard questions, but I think that's the purpose of this session, is to try to get some of these ideas aired. So
absolutely, and I think that, at least for me, part of the answer is that if we continue to develop the innovations unequally, right? If we do not acknowledge right from the start the impact of the power dynamics, the impact of the many systemic biases, right, that guide technological development and science, including a culture of white supremacy, for instance, including patriarchy, including the many systemic biases that guide scientific research, then we will never end up with an end product that promotes equity or equality in some way, or approximates it, right? So the response to me is emphasizing the importance of fostering technological developments across the world, right? In my profession, so I'm a bioethicist and have worked mostly in genetics genomics. What is really important, and this relates back to the previous question, is empowering a cadre of young African scholars to interrogate and shape African perspectives on science, right, without needing to articulate or define those perspectives in relation to the work of others, or in relation to powers that reside elsewhere. So fostering African science and scientists who can hold their own internationally, and yet authoritatively shape innovations here, that seems to me to be absolutely essential. Yet so much stands in the way of achieving that goal, right? So, and the people on this panel and many others can share exactly what stands in the way of achieving technological development that is endogenous. There's a wonderful Beninese philosopher who writes about endogenous African theory development, Pauline Hotinji, and that seems to me to be one of the crucial parameters. And if it's not that, right, if actually what we are seeing in the space of gene drive research is this unequal, technologies developed here and tested here, where the people here decide, what kind of community engagement we need, what relational ontology means for how we think about consent. If that agenda is not driven from and by people on the African continent, then the outcome can never be equity.
Terrific, thank you, Jantina. And let me work backwards through the ranks. Phil, I'm going to come back to you for a second, because you have, I think, quite a unique perspective on what it might take at a funder's level to try to operationalize some of the ideas that Jantina just sort of mentioned. And I know from my personal experience on those programs just how much effort and thinking went into try to realize some of those ideas that Jantina was talking about. So I wonder if you could talk, Phil, about how how to incorporate some of this reasoning and some of these ways of thinking into the investment in the scientific development itself. Because if it doesn't happen upstream, there's no obvious point for it to be picked up.
Sure. Well, I can give an example. I'll give a very specific example that addresses that, and that is the work in gene drive being done in that's led by Diabate in Burkina Faso. Diabate is, one of the best scientists in mosquitoes in the world. As a researcher, he's just fantastic. And he's leading the effort there. He's driving the effort in gene drive in Burkina, and actually I think is an incredible representative for the technology globally. And so in terms of the work that's funded early on, so he's I would consider him a co-developer of the technology, its applications, and it's being done in a place where the malaria burden is very high. And it's really important is not only have great scientific leaders that are driving the work on the continent, but it being done in a relevant place where you can actually prove efficacy. It becomes very important to do the science in a place where malaria burden is very high. And then when you eventually get to doing, if you end up getting to the point where you actually end up doing testing, you can actually show whether it works or not, because there's nothing worse than doing experiments out, doing clinical, the equivalent of a clinical trial in a place where you can't prove efficacy. And so he's in the right place to be doing gene drive research for malaria. And he's an incredible leader in that respect. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, maybe just one additional point then, Phil. I mean, could you just take us inside the Gates Foundation and the FNIH thinking about the structure of those partnerships initially, and how you ensured in those initial decisions that Diabate would have what he needed, and his team and his institutions what they needed? Because I think some of the other comments that we've heard have been about the nature of partnerships and how those are so essential to making sure that what you said can be realized.
Well, the work in helping build the capacity on the ground there was funded well ahead of the maturity of gene drive technology. And so, in other words, that was the capacity building funding, which is lab infrastructure, funding community engagement, and all these different aspects, not just the working on the technical aspects of de-risking technology, but also on the social license to operate, and also the legal license to operate within the environment, all funded at risk years before we even knew that the gene drive in malaria could actually work. It was more of a dream than a reality. It was theoretically, we thought it could technically work, but it hadn't been technically proven in the lab. So there was already robust funding at risk before those seminal papers came out years back. And so I think that, and so by doing that, as the technology matures, you have an incredible science base already. If the technology would have flopped, that capacity would have been built anyway and would have been used for many other purposes. And so that's how I think about it.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks, Phil. And having visited Diabate in Burkina, I know those were really wonderful capacity. I think that's being built there. So appreciate that. Nanjira.
Yeah, I wanted to pipe in there and just say it's interesting and important to highlight that somebody like Diabate, but we also must ask as a follow-up question, knowing that there's talent that could either be trained or that creates other Diabates, why are we not seeing a proliferation where here we would be talking about having a more equal footing in these conversations? And this brings us to a number of things. One, that I'm sure we'll get to a question that has been alluded to, how we frame these issues from a developmental lens, the individual Diabate as a poster, also obfuscate from what is preventing from institutionalizing or normalizing having as many Diabates in every country as possible. And to show just what I mean by praxis, and the African Academy of Sciences that was set up here in Nairobi is unfortunately about to go under because the mechanisms of institutionalizing have failed. Now, the accountability is something that remains to be seen if it will be held. But here are other Diabates who are actually really excited about change in the course of things, who were tired of talking about the problems and the ethic dumping and all that jazz, who are actually gearing up to do the work. And between whoever was put in the political realm of power in the institution, the funding mechanisms, the institution will not last. To show you that sometimes also we have to remember the bigger picture, even as we spotlight a Diabate. It's not taking the shine from him that he exists and is doing important work, but there's a systemic challenge, not just by, it has exogenous and endogenous factors to why we are not seeing that being the norm on this continent.
Yeah, and I think the point's very well taken. I think the idea is not to see Diabate as an end point in achievement, but more kind of representativeness of the kinds of capabilities, capacities, talents that exist on the continent so that we don't lose sight of that. But I wanted to go to David about site selection, but David, just let me stick with this theme for a second before we turn there. And David, I'll come to you with this. The challenge I think that Nanjira has raised is one of, and all of you discussed this in your opening statements, really is one of investment. And how should we think about making progress on investment in those institutions that Nanjira just mentioned, in the individuals, in education, in the building the human infrastructure on the continent that will be necessary to move all of this forward. So again, these are big questions, but any thoughts, David, about what kinds of activities, what kinds of actions do we need to be taking and thinking now? What do we need to do differently than what we're doing now for that to really move forward?
All right. Speaking about this, I'm thinking about various players in this. And as international funders and collaborators, I think one of the things that they need to establish are like academic programs that ensure that, which are sustainable, as Nanjira said, that will remain there for a while to train upcoming scientists in Africa, because that is the best way to build the capacity, to strengthen the capacity of the local communities. But again, the local governments have got a very big role to play here. First of all, by also funding and also ensuring that there are regulations that ensure that some of these activities are institutionalized. So I had mentioned about the way we individualize some of these projects, which are very important. But if you're going to base everything on an individual, it might collapse depending on the kind of individual or the feature of the individual, because people stay and they go, and people also have their own interests. So the best way is to ensure that we institutionalize this, but we have a sustainable plan to ensure that more of these people are now brought up and the situation continues.
And David, I think in some respects that does pick up on one of your initial points about kind of intergenerational obligations. I mean, here we're talking about who owes what to whom. And in a sense, what you're saying is that there's a general set of obligations to next generations of Africans and current generations of African students and scientists. And we are seeing upticks, I think, in direct investments in health and science in a lot of countries, but we still have a long way to go. In the interest of time, I want to just change direction slightly. David, I wanted to stay with you since you raised the idea initially, and it's about this idea about site selection, and Jantina raised this point as well. But David, the point you made was that we often choose, for gene-derived research in particular, we choose sites that are more geographically isolated or have some sort of natural boundaries to prevent spread. Your point is that those don't always mirror the actual social epidemiology of the disease in question here, which is malaria, which is a big problem in urban environments. So I wonder if you just say a few more words about how to bridge those kind of challenges. On the one hand, the safety ideas of some isolation and natural isolation, and how we might start anticipating movement into urban areas.
All right. First of all, let me just speak about what Jantina and also Phil mentioned about site selection and also looking at the vulnerability. And if you look at what's happening right now and the selection of regions within Africa, you'll find that there could be some imbalance in the way some of these sites have been selected. I'm not accusing anybody, but I'm saying that the site that target malaria is already working on seem to be a bit off in terms of balance of regions. You'll find that we have like 3 countries from West Africa and 1 country from East Africa, none from Southern Africa, and we also have some northern part of Africa, which are not part of the sample. And if you look at all these countries, it's only 1 country that has got high prevalence for malaria. That is Uganda. And this one can raise issues like, why should you not choose the red zones first, or at least have a bigger percentage of the sample from the red zones? But that is something that can be discussed. Then let me come to what I had mentioned earlier, that I also read and I realized that there is a specific, either deliberate or unconscious selection of remote places, particularly the rural places. And my experience with malaria is that malaria is all over. It's in rural places, majority might be in the rural places, but also in urban places. Being a victim and having lived all my life in urban places, I can say that it will be unfair to leave out urban places and concentrate on rural places. And it could also raise an issue of, if you look at the constitution, the constituents of urban places, it's a mixed kind of community. And also, we have people who are a bit more empowered in terms of access to information and also consciousness about their rights. And therefore, it might be a deliberate move to use those people who are not so much empowered. But in order to bridge this, I think the best thing is, first of all, let us have a balanced way of sampling the places that we want to carry out this research, and give preference to places which are more, prone to malaria, because that one will give at least justification, as Phil was saying, about this kind of activity. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. And Jantina, does that square with your, your point that you made about human rights, about this idea of the right to access to the fruits of science and technology? Do we have to rethink that paradigm of testing? I mean, it's been heavily skewed towards safety. I mean, it reminds me in some ways about, old views of research with on pregnant women and children, where we went for decades, centuries, not collecting data on pregnant women, and then we had nothing to offer them. So is there something there in what David's saying that speaks to that point about the right to access? Oh, Jantina, the most common phrase in the English language these days, you're on mute.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
I was saying that's an interesting question that requires me to think a bit. I thought you were going to ask a different question.
Well, answer the different one then, if that's
it comes back to giving people, for me, the response to your question comes back to giving people who are affected by the disease that is being addressed, right, in this case, malaria, the right to decide for themselves, not as individuals, Jason, I see your point, not as individuals, as communities or as countries, to decide where this research ought best take place. And what it strongly brings to mind is an example from genomics research, where human genomics researchers interested in diversity went to rural Namibia to collect blood samples from some elderly San men, really older men. In rural areas, David spoke about the concept of empowerment. These people were disempowered in at least in their ability to engage in what they were being asked to participate in. And the South African SAN Council, when they then heard, when this paper was published and they heard of this experiment and they saw the pictures of these really old San men living in rural Namibia, they were really offended. And the SAN Council president in South Africa at the time said, "Why do you come in through the window like a thief in the night?" Right? Why do you go to our weakest point and get their samples? Why didn't you come to us and ask us and came in through the door? Right? Why didn't you discuss with us? If you wanted blood samples from the sun, you come to the people who are empowered to engage with you. And you might have gone to those people in Namibia, but you would have had context and an appreciation of culture and values and customs and things. And so to me, the response to your question is, it's not up to us to decide who participates, right? Or on what terms. I think it's up to the people who suffer the burden of disease, who are probably, hopefully, allegedly going to benefit from scientific progress, to decide who should participate. I wonder if Nanjira is disagreeing with me, or are you agreeing? Or are you just so shocked with the sun example?
Yeah.
No, I was just recalling that I'd read about it, so maybe my face was registering, the visceral reaction one would have, right?
Yeah, but Nanjira, then what is the analog? What is the door in the analogy from Jantina's point? Because it seems to me that one of the things that, again, to kind of stay on the theme of the webinar, of the obligations and the nature of the obligations and the nature of the responsibilities, I think, Jantina, you're emphasizing points really of procedural fairness, as well as substantive fairness, which we obviously, this is where we want to end up. But Nanjira, I wonder, what are the fair procedures and what is that door that we're looking for?
It really is these values, right, that we keep saying are human values. But in practice, we know that even when we have instruments like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what we all interpret from them is a point of departure. And the fact of the matter is, for too many folks, the African is not on the same plane that they would afford the same values, dignity, respect, humility. And that's usually the most interesting thing, because when we come across these kinds of realities and quite visceral reactions, as I heard it, for example, just now, that most people frame the question then as what can we do, and seem to think of it as a technical fix. Maybe it's something that we code better into the process and the systems that and institutions we already set up. But it's back to first principles, really. Are we really ready as scholars, as investors, as the power holders in this domain to afford that human value, that human dignity to that subject, whether it's the San in Namibia or the Turkana in northern Kenya, or any other group that, you know, depending on how we're imagining them or have fantasized them or have imagined we were here to rescue them. Are we really willing? And as that's seeded in the teams that will go subsequently into these spaces, to understand that these are people, like I said, as Chinua Achebe put it, they're not just guinea pigs, they're not just fiction, they're people. And the more we run away from it, the more we come back to the same issue, even with more fantastical failures. We have more tools that get us closer and faster, but the same failures because we have not gone back to these first principles. So maybe it's time to sit with the discomfort of it all.
Great. And Phil, you know, I keep wanting to come back to your experience with trying to actually enable these research activities in the very first place. And again, in part, it was a response to applications from scientists who were far enough along with their development of their ideas around the technologies that they were able to kind of seek that investment, and most weren't. But I guess maybe let me ask it this way, picking up on the thread that we're just talking about here. If you were to start it again today, would there be anything that you might do differently in terms of this question about, you know, kind of procedural fairness, doing things differently and ethically? I mean, there are any lessons along the way, Phil, that you think might offer slightly new approaches?
The only thing I think the approach, you know, we were lucky and I guess not lucky in that it took a long time for the technical part to get worked out. So we had a lot of time to think about how this might be done in a fair way. So I think the only thing that I wish we had more time to do is on the communication front in these technologies, to be able to better articulate it in a very visual way, so that you can explain the technology across lots of different settings. And so that's all I can think of. In terms of the sites, rural versus urban, I don't believe there was any intention to go to rural sites because somehow people are less sophisticated or anything at all. It has more, I think the site selection specifically was done by the scientists on the ground in those countries where they thought it was technically easier to do the experiment. And actually I can give an example of that, which you're familiar with the Tony James work in Mexico with the mosquito cages, where all of a sudden there was a train track that was then put in that went right through the site, and all of a sudden the site was gone. And so because of development. And so there are issues with doing things in urban areas because those environments aren't so controlled. They're extremely dynamic. And over a 7-10 year period, if you pick an urban site, just look at Nairobi. The last time I was there, I didn't recognize it. And so that's not a place where you can actually basically prepare to do an experiment. And then the last thing that I'd like to say is that, and this is a real tension with what I call the sort of the ideal global health intervention, and that's gene drive, which is really area wide and it's egalitarian. And that's the beauty of it, is that no matter what your income, whatever your education level, whatever, everyone benefits. And so there's not an access issue. There's not an access issue between urban and rural. There isn't an access issue between rich and poor. It is the most egalitarian type of intervention that you can have, which is what you would want in a global health intervention. However, because it's so egalitarian, that's where the tension comes in with the the individualistic sort of decisions on that. And so that's a tension that is a function of its being so egalitarian. So I think that's it. Yeah.
So I was just going to say, Phil, maybe in there, again, trying to tie to the theme of the webinar today, maybe it's been kind of implicit. You just made it more explicit that maybe there's an obligation in global health programming to take more egalitarian types interventions really seriously. Maybe this is an example of the complexity of that, being taken seriously. So a great point. So we have maybe about 10 minutes to go before we open up for some Q&A from the audience today. I wonder if there's any of you have any other comments that you'd like to make. I've been trying to make some threads along all of your comments, but anyone have anything in particular that they'd like to pick up on any of the other comments so far? Okay, so we have a shy bunch of panelists today. Let me pick up on I want to keep, since this is an ethics session as well, I really want to stay focused for a minute or two more on what, in practical terms, needs to change in order for us to get to the more kind of robust type of ethics that we've been discussing. So I think there's very little disagreement about some of the substantive changes that we would all like to see. But how do we get there, especially when we're working, say, in research ethics, as I said before, in a paradigm that is just so deeply entrenched around individual permissions and consent and autonomy? What do we actually have to do in concrete terms to move towards this more robust type of ethics of humility and praxis?
Jim, I'll take your question and just say what I think we should not do.
Okay, that's a start. That's a start. Yeah.
And it's because we have similar conversations happening in other fields like AI and such about ethics and what's the way forward. Let me just say, let's not imagine that we have to reinvent the wheel. We still have, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stopped at having an identical and accompanying Universal Declaration of Duties and Responsibilities. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights is perhaps the only human rights instrument that has tried to pair and balance the nuances around the individual versus the community, duties and responsibilities. It's probably due for a refresh given the contemporary times we're living in. But as it's written, it's one of the only charters that can also help us, guide us into thinking about these ethics and how we bring them to these issues as we're thinking about them. And the philosophies, and David here should pipe in, I think, around our own philosophies, what they actually mean to inform ethics work. In the field of artificial intelligence, there's one South African scholar, Sabelo Mhlambi, who's been looking at Ubuntu as a way of thinking about AI ethics. And that's a really important starting point to show how you're contextualizing these issues, because in as much as we want to find a universal frame, we are not a monolithic lot. So this is another way to really bring other fields, go cross-disciplinary, to understand that the way ethics will apply in gene drive research is not removed from ethics or other considerations from anthropological, ethnographic, and other fields. So just, maybe not reinvent the wheel. There's already a lot of work going on out there. Familiarize yourself with it.
And David, do you want to pick up on Nanjira's terrific point there?
Yes, I think the most ideal approach to how we can do things right is by respecting contexts, and particularly worldviews. We need to understand how people think in their own indigenous contexts, and respect that when we are developing projects or we are implementing some of these ideas. I would also want to challenge the research community and scientists in general to at least ensure that they have diverse disciplines within some of these issues, because most of the people who conduct either biomedical research or clinical research, they just tend to think as scientists who have been taught in a certain way, but they also fail to recognize that we also have other scientists who can help them to either deal with the community, understand the community, and be able to solve some of the issues that normally come up. So interdisciplinarity of some of these ideas need to be normalized in Africa, particularly because of the nature of the African communities. And if you have people from diverse disciplines, then some of these issues will not be a big challenge. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you, David. Let me just ask one more question before we open up to Q&A. Jantina, I'm going to come to you with this one. And again, it comes back to this idea about the right to access to the fruits of science and technology. And there, as you know very well, there's been a very long-standing debate within research ethics about whether that very idea also gives rise to an obligation on the part of communities to participate in research. And I wonder if there's an argument to be made that because of what Phil was describing as the potentially deep egalitarian nature of these technologies, whether there is some sort of corollary obligation on the part of communities to participate or to help facilitate that research to be done.
So that's a very tantalizing question in some ways, but I think there is a pre-consideration, right? So Phil, I like your optimism about these gene drive technologies being the ultimate egalitarian global health intervention, but I think what comes before that statement is an agreement by everyone involved that is indeed the case, and merely stating that is true is not enough. And I think Nanjira and David and myself have cautioned against kind of the introduction of new technological approaches, new scientific methods to the African continent without robust and thorough engagement with a multitude of stakeholders, right? Because there seems to me to be something, in the very nature of gene drive research and the way that science is developed that hasn't properly involved many stakeholders on the continent. And that is partly, I think, because what we lack is a critical mass, right? And so I liked Nanjira's mentioning of some of the work that is going on in Ubuntu philosophy. The challenge that I see, having worked in ethics of genomics in Africa or African genomics for quite a while now, is that these are lone voices, right? We have some really brilliant people working on ethics and African ethics or African philosophy with an interest in technology, but they're lone voices. There's someone, you know, here, and there's someone in that country, and there's someone like Nanjira in Nairobi, but until and unless that community, right, becomes gathers sufficient critical mass, that it's very difficult then to have these debates, right, on the continent. And so it's no surprise, and it's no accusation towards something like the Gates Foundation or other entities not being able to access, you know, a concerted, consolidated, thorough reflection from African scholars, and particularly African philosophers and African ethicists, on the desirability of technological avenues, right? Innovation, science. And that to me is where a lot of the work needs to happen, because it's not just saying we need engaged science or we need thinking through, sorry, I'm not answering your question at all. I'm answering my own question, which is what next? And to me, the real work is connecting people like Nanjira and David and the people I work at the University of Cape Town, and the people in Pretoria and Lagos, and to provide the opportunity to have these internal debates, to do this endogenous theory building that Pauline Hutinji reminds us is necessary in order for us to, I guess, as scholars on the African continent, to inform technological and scientific development in ways that respect indigenous values, including relational ontology and how that implies, you know, how that applies to how we think about procedural ethics and procedural justice.
Great, thank you, Jantina. And the last point I'll make before we open it up is, you know, the first part of your comment just raised the question in my mind about, since we know that we don't have all those capacities and infrastructure that you just described so nicely, and since we know that malaria is still an enormous burden on, especially on children and women, and because we know that the science is still in early development, I mean, is there an obligation to start? You know, and it seems to me that that's kind of what we're stuck with. You know, there's been decisions to start, probably in recognition of all of these different elements, and it may be that we can't do anything more than start. But it's how to incorporate all that thinking that you guys have offered in these thoughts today that is the challenge for us going forward. So really, really terrific comments from all of you. We also have the luxury on these webinars of having an extraordinary wealth of knowledge and experience in the audience. And so I think what we'll do now is we'll turn to some of the questions that have come up. I've been trying to sort of keep track a little bit, and some of them I think have already been answered a little bit. So I'm going to start with Jason Delborn, and I'm assuming that Jason can't come on to do the question on video. So I'll read the question here. So Jason says, I do see Phil's point about the potential for gene drive to be egalitarian, affecting large areas of population, although the degree that this would be true will depend a great deal on the design and deployment decisions. For example, there's a great deal of research on spatially and temporally limited gene drives, partly out of concern for safety and control, and such technologies would not automatically become egalitarian in the sense that you had expressed, Phil. So Phil, any thoughts about that? It's a great comment.
Yeah, I mean, there are different flavors to the technologies, and And so agree that it's going to be based on the specific construct and the specific use case. And so, but I think the aspiration is to be able to eventually have something that's fully egalitarian. And we see that for a similar but non-genetic type of technology with Wolbachia, where now the where the JAMA not the JAMA but the New England Journal of Medicine paper came out in June with the Wolbachia trial in Indonesia, where now 400,000 people will be protected from dengue transmission. Unfortunately, that that technology isn't really applicable to practically applicable to malaria, but we have something where the an entire population of a city is now protected from dengue, Zika, chikungunya, etc. And that's also the case in Medellin, Colombia. I think that's the aspiration, and I think that's and protecting everyone is I think a noble goal.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so I'm going to go on to a question from Abba Saxena. She says that some of the discussants raised issues such as why rural and why not urban, or why West Africa and not South Africa. But what about obligations of researchers and sponsors of these technologies and the governments of countries where these technologies are implemented in communicating widely about justifications and rationales for the decisions taken? It's a really good question, I think, because we tend to provide communications and talking points, but there's very little emphasis, I think, on providing justification, which really gets us deeper towards fairness and justice kinds of thinking. So let's see, Nanjira, maybe would you like to take a stab at this one?
I'll jump sectors, if you will, and just look at more popular technologies, even outside of gene drive work. And I want to use the example of social media and Facebook, for example, as a company, just to try and situate Abba's excellent question. It has not been in their interest to justify why they do stuff they do. For example, they have interned one day in a bunch of countries that they've decided anyhow change the structure of the news feed because they were running internal experiments. A lot of this justification comes out after some scholar somewhere has caught something being awry. And then, they're taken through all these FOIA type investigative processes. And so the leap and the time between when we get the justification and what has happened is usually it's not happening in real time. But this is because that's how it's all structured to work. The incentives are to capture as much as possible. And that's how I was bringing the parallel, because we are seeing that jump as these technologies influence how gene drive research will happen. To first grab the market, right? First corner it, block out everybody else, and then you decide when and how you do that. And the easiest way to do it is make sure that yours is the only available or tool. It's nearly the public utility. So I imagine that in this kind of field, there could be some parallels easily drawn. Maybe yours is the only clinic that has been introduced, but to go in there, first you have to deposit some DNA or something like that. So it's a lot of this is a moral question that should be brought up to governments and to companies, but there's a power dynamic too, because the power that they have collectively, and when they decide that they're the decision makers and exclude researchers, exclude civil society, exclude collectives of various forms, we're living in a power imbalance that challenges that. But I think continually speaking up to it and calling out the moral injustice that it really is. We can't really be shaping a future where that's the case, and we must appeal, if you will, for that kind of justification to happen in real time. And in fact, before a decision is made about a choice of technology or a choice of tool applied in our lives and in our bodies. I think it speaks to the unresolved issues and the shifts in power in society today.
Terrific. And it, you know, your comment does kind of reach back into those concerns that you raised earlier about power. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 10 years in particular in global health is the kind of progressive incursion of private equity financing of R&D, and with its own special flavor of power dynamics that can have distorting effects on the way that public institutions make decisions. So that's a great point. Okay, next we go to Michael Santos, and I find astrophysicists often ask the hardest questions. So Michael, thank you. So what do countries and their communities owe the rest of the world regarding environmental risk management? Our foreign stakeholders owed some role in decision-making because we view the environment anywhere as belonging in part to people everywhere. And I would say that, you know, given our current global experience of COVID, even though it's manifesting very differently because of differential access to vaccines, it does drive home the point that that Michael's making here, that it's not, you know, it's not even just environmental issues, but some of these health threats themselves. So who would like to? There's a question coming up for David, so maybe Jantina, I'll turn to you on this one. You're getting a lot of the really hard ones, Jantina. That's the, you know, you philosophers, like, never shy away from the really difficult questions.
And I'm not even a philosopher, I'm a sociologist.
Oh yeah, exactly. So
it's again, it's a really interesting question. And unfortunately, I'm going to give the same response that I gave before. And that is that there's two parts to this question, right? So the first is, if you know, we speak about research that is located on the African continent, and I get Abba's point that we'll get later on, you know, like the danger of speaking about Africa as a country and not a continent.
Yes.
If we think about, you know, research being located in particular countries in Africa, then what is really important is to develop an appreciation of the way of the role and the place of nature and the environment in African ontologies, right? So that we can build up an account of ethics or an ethics theory that responds to that. And what I mean by that is, it sounds a bit cryptic, but insofar as I know and understand African philosophy, there are really sophisticated ways in which African philosophers have dealt with or responded to or spoken about the environment and relations with nature, right, as being an integral part of what it means to be a good human, and fostering kind of human flourishing and the role of nature in promoting human flourishing, and so on and so forth. Now, if our ethics account, or the ethics account that we apply to thinking through a topic like environmental risk does not take account or is not situated in or rooted in a deep engagement, deep understanding of African philosophy, or if you will, Burkina philosophy or the Burkinabe philosophy, then I'm a bit worried about questions like this, because you know, whose account of environment and nature are we speaking about, and who sets what should be considered risks and what should be responsibilities in relation to the environment. So that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question, Michael, it made me chuckle a bit, because what if we turn that on its head and think about the world, or revert the power imbalances that we see in the world completely, and argue that actually people in Burkina Faso are owed some role in decision-making about the environment and environmental risk in the United States, or in Canada, or in France, or, right? What if we turn the question on its head, or turn the world on its head? And do we still think that the people of Burkina or Kenya, we've got two Kenyans on our panel, that the people of Kenya are owed a right to decide how the South African government regulates its role or relation to the environment, right? Its energy policy. And it strikes me that we would reject an account that tells us that we have such a right, right? And so that problematizes that question somewhat, because, or it possibly reveals some assumptions that we are making when we are framing questions like that, that are actually unhelpful. That would be my
Yeah, I mean,
question.
Terrific points, Jantina. And it, I think it takes us to a clearer view that we're not in technologies like gene drive, we're not just talking about the conventional, extraordinarily narrow, common rule research ethics paradigm, a regulatory paradigm that has now become a de facto standard around the world. We're really talking about deep problems in political philosophy. I think Mike's question really is about whose interests should be privileged and who should have standing even in those conversations and in any decision kind of rights as they come along. So we're really in the realm of political philosophy, and our research ethics paradigm is almost antithetical to the kinds of thinking that we're talking about. So I think we have a lot of work to do to maybe start reimagining how the research ethics paradigm can start accommodating some of these deeper problems and questions in political philosophy. So that's terrific. Okay, so next we have a question from Diane Ray-Kayan. And David, I think we're going to throw this one to you. There are a couple coming to you, but we'll throw this one to you first. There was mention of concern about where research was not taking place. For example, you raised the example of Uganda, but research may be more likely to take place where scientists have pre-existing relationships with collaborators and in countries that welcome or help support this research and have processes in place that facilitate the research in some countries more than others. And that, as we know in this space as well, also has included at least some thinking about what existing regulatory capacities and biosafety type assessment capacities exist. Initial research efforts tend to lead to additional research in the same location among the same collaborators. And how does one address these imbalances between countries? And I'll throw this to you, David, but then Phil, I maybe ask you to weigh in on this as well, because I know that you have some experience in those initial discussions, at least on the initial gene drive investments at the foundation about that. So David.
My first take is that I think research should not be a convenience affair. It should not be done out of convenience. It should respect all aspects of science itself and also ethics. And that's why Jantina talked about what happened in South Africa and the reason why it was not possible to carry out gene drive research in South Africa. It clicked my mind that there could be a bigger issue here about regulations and policies which researchers might tend to run away from. And talking about convenience and also partnerships, as the person who asked the question said, there is that tendency of people over collaborating or doing collaboration because of one or two interests. And this one results to, it could result to, research generally result to good things, but it could also result to some other things which are not so good, including over researching and also research fatigue for people who are over researched, because collaborations are easy. And this, I don't think at the end of the day, in the long run, it's something that we can say is ethical. So I think we need, what we need as in this situation are robust regulations on even how collaborations are done and how research and where research is done. That's my take. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. And Phil, just to kind of tee up your thoughts here. I mean, I was, looking back at the second of your, well, the first two actually of your 6 freedoms, the freedom to innovate, and again, sort of channeling Calestis Juma, but this idea of a freedom to lead and to try and to test. And science isn't the most democratic of enterprises. It's essentially a kind of marketplace, and a competitive marketplace at that. And I wonder, if your notion about the freedom to lead and to try, whether that's also part of the answer to the question that's on the table.
Yeah, so can you rephrase that, the lead to try? So I was going to try to answer the
So
go ahead.
This is a great example of the moderator disruption effect. It's a well-known effect. So I'll rephrase it and then maybe answer the way you were going to. I was just trying to pick up on the point in the question about how do you address the imbalances. I guess the question I'm asking is, can you address the imbalances?
Well, a few things. One, regarding South Africa, I'm can assure that the choice of, say, target malaria not working in South Africa, but working in the countries it's working in, had nothing to do with how the level of regulation in South Africa. The target malaria is working on Aphelis gambiae, and so again, you have to go where that species is most prevalent. And so there are it was a very complex set of questions to arrive at the country. Second, actually, Uganda is a country where research is being done in gene drive. And finally, I think back to freedom of innovate, no one is stopping anyone from doing gene drive research in South Africa, and no one is stopping the South African government from funding or other entities from funding gene drive research in Africa. So I don't think it's fair to place the entire burden of sites of where research is being done in Africa just on target malaria. There's a limited amount of resources. And when you're doing something early, you don't want to be doing it in dozens of sites because that's unmanageable. To be methodical and careful and to be able to do it right and at the right pace, it's important to select a few places where the entire matrix of all the different sort of aspects of making a decision of the best place to do the work is made. And part of that is having receptive, excellent scientists on the ground in those countries as well. So it's a complicated choice, and places aren't left out. It would be great if we could, if there was enough resource and money just to start research in every single country, but that's not possible financially, and it's not possible logistically. So you start with a few sites, you build up, and you start expanding. And I think one of the nice things is the group in Burkina Faso has a huge World Bank grant to build capacity in vector biology. And so here you're taking the experience of doing work in this type of technology, but Diabates Institute works on a number of other mosquito technologies too. And then World Bank comes in and gives a grant to actually train a lot more scientists in the continent. And so, it's got to happen organically. And it's got to, and it's got to happen in a way that allows the work to be done carefully and progress, and that knowledge to expand within the continent. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's terrific, Phil. I mean, I think it's a great set of comments on the question. So,
Can I, sorry to interrupt you, Jim, just to add, like,
Jantina, please.
add just a little bit of reflection to that, so Diane, just to say that is again a really good question, and I don't think that it's easy to address this, and I just want to refer to the experiences of the H3 Africa Consortium, which I think were somewhat different in the sense that grants were specifically made out to African institutions and African PIs who themselves are defined what the research questions ought to be. But even in that collaboration, what happens there is that the stronger African countries scientifically were overrepresented. So Uganda was there, Makerere, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and some other countries as well, strongly represented. Other countries were off the radar almost completely. The DRC, Congo, other places, and so what strikes me as being really important in all of these discussions is to remember that these discussions are important outwardly, right, between kind of researchers in Africa as a collective and those that come from elsewhere, but they're also really important internally. So that the power dynamics inherent to researchers from Zambia and South Africa, where South Africa is the giant, right, setting the agenda, and the Zambians are trying to play catch up, is very similar to what we've described in terms of kind of north-south relationships. So just wanted to add that sophistication or nuance to the question. Apologies, Jim.
No, that was actually terrific, Jantina, because we just have a few minutes left, and I really wanted to try to get Anna Kormos's question in. And in a sense, I think that the last couple of comments have sort of started to address it. It's a great question. I'm going to read it just so that we're all on the same page about it. And I think we probably don't have time to get any deeper into it, but I appreciate your points, Jantina, because I think they address it to some degree. So Anna said that David mentioned local African government's role in institutionalizing capacity building and providing support for African scientific communities. Can we talk a bit more about the role of African government and leaders in addressing these important concerns? And additionally, much of the investment and financial support for capacity building surrounding gene drives comes from just a few sources. And how does this factor into the issue of power dynamics, and how might this be addressed? So maybe if anyone has we have 3 minutes. If anyone has a burning point to make in 1 minute, then we have to hand it back over to Rafik to wrap up. If not, then we can just kind of let the question stand, because in a sense, I think it frames a broad kind of thing. So, okay, Nanjira.
I could never miss out on mentioning something about African government. So let me see if I can do it in a minute. It's not, their role is not removed from the bigger questions we've been talking about. And just to, for example, what the West calls austerity, we've been living under what have been called structural adjustment programs in Africa for the better part of 3-4 decades. What that has meant is governments have less and less money that they can actually put into factors like institutions, labs, universities even, because they're all being asked to privatize that. So because those are the instructions coming from the flawed financial institutions and systems that govern the world today, it has limited the role that they're able to play in terms of direct investments. And that really ties to your brilliant observation about the power dynamics that then settle in specific fields, because the resources that can come in other words are just coming from very few actors. It's a complex question. Maybe a future forum should just sit with the question of capacity in African governments. That would make for a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, terrific. And yeah, I think structural adjustments and, the burden of debt is just an enormous part of the backdrop of the many injustices that all of these conversations take place on top of. So my thanks to all of you panelists for really outstanding contributions. And I'm going to hand it back to Rafik for the last minute or so to wrap us up.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Lavery. And again, thank you very much for facilitating this discussion. It's definitely a great discussion with many perspectives, giving us a lot to think. I also want to thank our panelists, David, Nanjira, Jantina, and Phil, for generously sharing their time, views, and opinions. And lastly, I also want to thank everyone else from around the globe that's taken time out of their busy schedules and joining us today. So quickly want to touch on the next session. So the next session in the series is titled From Principles to Principled Action. In this session, we'll explore ethical principles to govern gene research. And again, this session is scheduled for October 12th, same time, 10 a.m. Eastern. And this session will be moderated by Ms. Catherine Littler, who co-leads the Global Health Ethics and Governance Unit at the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva. So that definitely should also be a very interesting session. And also, before we close the session formally, I'd just like to encourage everyone that's here to share these webinars with your colleagues and friends so we can have an even more engaged conversation on the unsettled ethical issues in gene drive research. And we look forward to seeing everyone next month. And until then, thank you and be well.